I'm going to spend quite a lot of time on context and rather than group analysis, because we can't really understand the sort of precarious state group analysis without taking into account the context. So we because this context in a way has created the predicament in the first place. So not only do we live in the time of austerity, we also live in the time of neoliberalism, of managerialism, and last but not least, in the times of pseudoscientific, evidence-based psychotherapies. And although each of these looks and sounds very different to the other, they are all manifestations of the same ideology, with each term seamlessly interlocking and legitimating the others, and it then presents us with an apparently unquestionable factual reality. So we're told that we have to face up to this reality, and we have to find ways to come to terms with it, to live with it. Now I work in private practice, so I'm able to practice a form of psychotherapy that has become marginal to the mainstream. In other words, my clients are drawn from circles that are privileged enough to be able to pay, even today, in this time of austerity. And most of those who cannot afford the luxury of the private sector are forced to endure the kind of evidence-based treatments that have been deemed to be effective by a vast consensus that includes commissioners, psychologists, and academic researchers. How has this situation come about, and what might we do about it? This is, if you like, the headings and the journey I'm going to do today. And as you see, group analysis comes rather late at the end. But I start with neoliberalism. At the heart of neoliberalism lies a deeply corrosive conception of the individual, an atomist individualism, a conception that does away with Kant's vision of social responsibility and replaces it with a hard-hearted vision of an each one for himself self-sufficiency. According to the neoliberalist ethos, each person should stand on their own 2 feet and pay their own way, as should every institution. It is morally wrong to support the weak and vulnerable and to subsidize public services because it breeds a culture of dependency and entitlement. The central organizing principle of this discourse is the God called efficiency, a God that knows the cost of everything and the value of nothing. The free market is said to be the instrument that produces this efficiency. The neoliberalists think that all state-run services, health, education, and so on, are by definition inefficient because they don't have to earn their own living. Therefore, they should all be privatized. Market forces and competition will ensure that they will become efficient. They claim that privatized institutions will provide a better service at a lower cost to the citizen. But not only is the macroeconomy of the nation being run according to these principles, so are the individual institutions and organizations that make up the nation. This way of thinking about and running organizations has come to be known as new public management or managerialism. Managerialism views the internal components of organizations as elements of an internal market economy. To this end, it fosters competition between these components in the same belief that competition will force them to become efficient and reduce overall costs. Managerialist policies are predicated on the individualistic belief that human beings are primarily autonomous, rational information processing entities, and so they focus on the individual's mind, on thought, on rational logic and empirical evidence. Managerialism claims to manage on scientific, evidence-based principles. Rationally constructed procedures and protocols instruct the workforce about what they should do and how they should do it. And when this does not work out, as mostly is the case, then one of 3 things tend to happen. First, employees are put through trainings that disseminate the information and train them how to better do what is expected of them. The second thing that happens is that even more procedures are drawn up, and these procedures tell you how to and when to use the initial procedures. And third, a monitoring process is increased to ensure that everyone is staying on track. And the burden of the monitoring process of the employee is placed on the employee themselves. So this is the individualistic, rationalist, cognitivist command and control ethos that is the norm in contemporary organizational life. More recently, organizational theories have started to take the emotions into account. However, their approach to the emotional life is with the same ethos. It is presumed that the emotions too can be and ought to be controlled by techniques and procedures to produce the correct emotions, the productive emotions. It is the case that over the last decades, a quiet revolution has been taking place that has resulted in two reversals. First, there has been a radical power shift from the professional, the one who actually does the work, to the bureaucrat, the one who is supposed to enable and facilitate the work. The servant has become master. The professional has to continually account to the bureaucrat through a data collecting process. And this has resulted in the second reversal, in which data collection has become more important than the work itself. Because data becomes the measure of success, not the work. This managerialist ethos is blind to the irony that their systems are creating increasing inefficiency. The requirement to produce performance of data leads the profession the requirement to produce performance data leaves the professional less and less time to actually perform. In this way, the tail has come to wag the dog. Managerialism is blind to this irony because it claims to use ideas that have empirical evidence to back them up. Its principles and processes are evidence-based. Well, the idea of empirical evidence was fostered by the Enlightenment. Evidence was the means by which the superstitious beliefs and self-serving claims of both church and state were overturned. The protocols by which this evidence was produced and tested is what we have come to call science. I am all for evidence, and I'm all for science. However, two things have come to pass. First, a very thin, one-dimensional understanding of evidence has become the norm in research, in management theory, and public life generally. And second, all kinds of disciplines, specifically psychology and economics, have come to mimic the natural sciences through the pretense of being able to measure the immeasurable. And it's also the case that as soon as a claim is put together with the phrase research shows, the claim is immediately treated as though it were established scientific fact. In this way, this phrase research shows draws a veil over a claim and puts it beyond the range of what it is thought to be reasonable to question. One such fact is that of the necessity for austerity. Another such fact is that only the treatments that have been able to produce empirical evidence of the approved kind actually work. In the current context in the UK, both these claims are treated as established, incontrovertible scientific truths. What I'm going to do next is look more closely at each of these truths in order to expose the mistruths they harbour and perpetuate. And I begin with austerity. A significant moment took place in 2008 when the world's financial institutions went into meltdown, and this was caused by the build-up of a number of corrupt and questionable banking practices, one of which was the fact that the banks lent out eye-watering sums of money to those who had little or no chance of paying back the debt. Why were they so keen to do this? Well, when the bank lends you money for your mortgage, for example, it is very different to the situation from the situation in which I might lend you some money. I have to lend you money that I actually possess. And if I lend you money, I will end up with less in my pocket and you will end up more. This is not the case with banks. When the bank lends you money, it is literally creating it out of thin air. The £100,000 that the bank puts into your account did not exist in the moment it appeared before it did not exist before it appeared in your account. When I first learned this, I was flabbergasted. I thought it was only the Bank of England that could create money, but this has not been the case for many a decade. This is from the Bank of England's report in 2014. Commercial high street banks create money in the form of bank deposits by making new loans. When a bank makes a loan, for example, to someone taking out a mortgage to buy a house, it does not typically do so by giving them thousands of pounds worth of banknotes. Instead, it credits their bank account with a deposit of the size of the mortgage. At that moment, new money is created. It turns out that 97% of the money in the economy is created by commercial banks, whilst just 3% is created by the government. There's a website called Positive Money, if you're interested in this. Reveals quite a lot. In other words, the creation of debt is the engine that drives our economy. Debt of this kind is necessary to the capitalist economy. The banks create money for us to borrow. We borrow, we spend, we pay the money back to the bank that they did not have in the first place. The banks end up with more money, the economy flourishes. But despite the fact that the banks had the ability to create limitless amounts of money, they managed to contrive a situation in which they needed to be bailed out. This is where the Exchequer stepped in with our money to the tune of hundreds of billions. How did the state manage to lay its hands on such enormous sums, given the fact that the Exchequer had been pleading poverty when it came to paying teachers and nurses a proper living wage? Well, they too simply created it and passed it on to the commercial banks. This economic sleight of hand is called quantitative easing. Well, the Conservative Party today perpetuates the narrative that the rocky economy has nothing to do with the banking crisis and entirely to do with the previous Labour government being profligate. They're alleged to have spent vast amounts of money that they did not have on health, education and welfare, and so they've created vast amounts of unsustainable public debt. And this is why the economy is suffering. In this scenario, spending cuts make perfect sense, thus austerity. But there are several critical problems with this rationale for austerity. First, they are misrepresenting the way the macroeconomy works by making it seem the same, that it works on the same principles as household bank accounts. But as we have seen, in the household account, debt is a bad thing and creates terrible consequences for those in debt. To the capitalist macroeconomy, debt is essential, debt is necessary. Well, the austerity agenda was also given academic credibility with the publication of scientific papers by a number of well-regarded economists, particularly the work of the highly influential Harvard economist Alberto Alesina, but also Reinhardt and Rogoff. According to the research and data they provided, spending cuts somehow stimulated the economy. The academic stature of these authors and the presence of graphs, numbers and statistics immediately gave their claims the stamp of scientific authority. But the idea itself was counterintuitive and did not make sense. Expansionary austerity, as it's called, expansionary austerity, claimed that in times of hardship, when money was scarce, the state should impose harsh spending cuts rather than put money into the economy, because this cutting has been shown to stimulate the economy. Counterintuitive or not, the evidence said that this was the case. And in order to explain why it worked, they came up with the following psychological theory. This is how they think an ordinary citizen would think. Because I know that at some point in the future the state will be smaller, the government need to pay less tax in, say, 20 years' time. For this reason, I will feel that I don't need to save that much money now. And because I know that I'll be paying less tax in 20 years' time, I will rationally decide that I don't need to be so cautious with the money I do have, and so I spend it today. This spending will stimulate the economy, which is how it will recover. Apparently, I will rationally decide to spend today, despite the fact that I might be struggling to feed my family and simply not have very much. If I did this, most people would think such action folly on my part, because the only way I could spend money when I don't have it is by putting myself further into debt. And yet the economists would claim that not only is this a rational choice, this is the choice we should rationally make. If this were indeed so, then it would not be just folly, but stupidity. Anyhow, stupidity or folly, on this basis, many governments around 2010 were convinced and put their nation through austerity-informed social policies. But then, about 2 or 3 years later, it was discovered that the statistical manipulations in each of these highly influential studies were deeply and critically flawed. A proper reading of the data suggested the reverse, that in times when the economy was struggling, what was required was stimulus, not cuts. Even the IMF, a capitalist institution if ever there was one, came to the same conclusion in its own official report. The economist Krugman tells us that since the global turn to austerity in 2010, every country that introduced significant austerity has seen its economy suffer, with the depth and suffering closely related to the harshness of the austerity. Krugman continues, by 2013, the entire edifice of Austerian economics had crumbled. Events had utterly failed to play out as the Austerians predicted. While the academic research that supported the doctrine had withered under scrutiny, the doctrine that ruled the world in 2010 has more or less vanished from the scene, except in Britain. Lucky us. Despite the fact that there is now an established international consensus amongst economists that in a depressed economy, austerity does more harm than good, Cameron's government continues to pursue the discredited austerity agenda. The reason for this is entirely ideological, and it is that of neoliberalism. Austerity is the pretext being utilised by Cameron and the Conservatives to pursue their ideological agenda of dismantling and privatising many of the functions of the state, from health to education to welfare. The primary purpose of austerity, the Telegraph admitted in 2013, is to shrink the size of government spending, or as Cameron put it in a speech later that year, to make the state leaner, not just now, but permanently. This then is what we are forced to conclude. The medicine called austerity is iatrogenic. Not only are the cuts increasing the suffering of vulnerable individuals, the economy itself is also suffering needlessly. The austerity agenda is a way of killing off many of the services provided by the nation through the statutory sector by using the rationale of austerity to starve them of funds. In this weakened state, they are easy game for the private sector to step in and take over and run them more efficiently. That is, to maximize profits at all costs for the benefit of shareholders. It is also the case that there is nothing in principle, only ideology, that prevents the government using quantitative easing, the same mechanism that it used to produce money to bail out the banks, to stimulate the economy. The argument for the necessity of austerity is plainly a lie. Nevertheless, it has been imposed on us, and we find ourselves living in a time of austerity. What has been the fate of psychology in such a time? It has always been the case, but particularly so in the time of austerity, that the exchequer and the regulatory bodies should be circumspect in how it spends our money. On this basis, they understandably favour treatments that have evidence to prove that they work. In the domain of psychology, primarily CBT, but also a few other modalities, have produced evidence to the satisfaction of the regulatory authorities. How is this evidence produced, and why is it produced in the way it is? Well, to answer this, I have to begin with some history. During most of the 20th century, both psychiatry and psychology struggled to be taken seriously by the rest of the scientific community. They were dismissed because the workings of mind and emotional life was not graspable by the protocols of positivist science. Then, in the second half of the 20th century, both psychiatry and psychology managed to refashion themselves into a semblance of a proper positivist science. To be considered science of this kind, you have to produce data, you have to count things, and you have to measure things. You have to produce numbers. For this reason, both of them turned away from engaging with the workings of the intangible, internal psychological world, and fixed their gaze on the surface of things, on the visible and tangible, on the observable and measurable. Well, with the publication of the DSM-3, psychiatry redefined itself as descriptive psychiatry and claimed to have solved the problem of objectivity, reliability and predictability. Henceforth, diagnoses were to be made by a checklist of allegedly objective symptoms. For example, this one, which you can't really see, anyway, on ADHD. But it's a checklist, and so you have to have if 5 of these are ticked, then you are said to have ADHD. For example, fails to pay close attention to details, has difficulty organising tasks and activation, easily distracted by external stimuli, forgetful in daily activities, talks excessively, and so on. So in this way, psychiatry positioned itself as a science. Well, psychology also turned away from the internal world. It too no longer troubled itself about the reasons why people suffer. Instead, they focused on the cause of what keeps the suffering going. To their way of thinking, depression and anxiety are disorders and illnesses. They have no more meaning than other illnesses like malaria or cancer. Leon and Clark say this: "It is not necessary to know what caused the cancer. You cure it by cutting it out. Similarly, infections are cured by antibiotics without knowing their causes." Both psychology and psychiatry think that people's psychological distress has little or nothing to do with their circumstances and history. Their suffering is caused by a mental illness or disorder that is listed in the DSM. And they allow for 2 possible causes for this kind of illness. It might be due to a chemical imbalance in the brain, in which case they're given drugs to rebalance the chemistry of the brain. But the illness might also be caused by habituated faulty thinking, and in this case they are put through a CBT to correct this faulty thinking. Now, regulatory bodies like NICE have licensed both these treatment paradigms because they have been convinced by hundreds, if not thousands, of clinical trials showing these treatments to be effective. Let us look next a little more closely, if briefly, into the research norms that prevail in this field. Well, to begin with, deregulation, the love child of neoliberalism, has permeated many areas of life, including research requirements. Over recent years, the requirements of clinical trials to demonstrate efficacy have been consistently lowered under intense pressure from pharmaceutical companies. Ben Goldacre is good on this. Of course, the lower the bar, the more successful everything will seem. So, for example, in 1959, a psychologist called Theodore Sterling found that 97% of all published trials in the main psychology journals reported a statistically significant result. Oh, I didn't have this. Quote. This, he explained, was plainly fishy, because we'd have to believe that almost every theory ever tested by a psychologist in an experiment had turned out to be correct. He found the situation unchanged 35 years later. How does psychology manage to be so successful? First, only trials that show positive results tend to get published. Second, the treatment is tested only against, needs to show itself to be better than doing nothing. So if it's a pill, it's tested against a placebo. But if it's if the treatment is psychological, then it is treated against a control group that literally get nothing. Treatment as usual, TAU, TAU as it is called. But as we know, anything is better than nothing. Third, the treatment is tested on a very particular specific ideal population. But if the treatment is shown to be helpful to this specific population, it is then given to the entire population. Fourth, in the paper, the publications themselves, raw data is not published, nor are the details of the calculations. What does get published is a highly digested numerical conclusion, which consists of citing something called a p-value, a figure that claims to show the outcome, whether the outcome of the treatment is of or is not of statistical significance. Fifth, you need just 2 trials that show a positive outcome for the treatment to be granted a license. And sixth, there is no limit to the number of trials that can take place in the pursuit of getting these 2 positive results. This then allows all kinds of crimes, misdemeanors and mistruths to prosper. Here are some examples. So with the antidepressant reboxetine, and all of this I've got from Ben Goldacre, with the antidepressant reboxetine, the publication field showed only positive results. But then it was discovered that actually there were other trials, 7 other trials, but the results of these showed that either people did not get better or in fact actually got worse. In the period from 1980, 17-year period from 87 to 2004, 74 clinical trials were registered, clinical trials for antidepressants were registered with the authorities. There would have been a lot more trials that weren't registered, but these are about the registered ones. Of these, 38 showed a positive result. 37 of them were published. 36 trials had negative results. Of these, 3 were published. 22 never saw the light of day. And astonishingly, 11 of them were published but written up as though the outcome was positive. So the end result is that in the literature field, you see 48 publications, 4 saying that antidepressants work, and 3 saying that they don't work. And it is in this way that the myth that antidepressants are a good treatment is created. Then it's also the case that out of those people currently being treated for depression, only about 1 out of 3 of them would have been allowed into the trial itself. And quite astonishingly, out of every 8 people suffering from depression who had volunteered to take part in a treatment trial, only 1 was allowed to participate. So it's a highly selected grouping that treatments are tested on. Results get talked up. So this is a paper that I did in the CBT conference and is published, and you can look at it in more detail if you like. And it's to do with mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. The abstract in this publication says that MBCT offers a promising, cost-efficient, psychological approach to preventing, note the word, preventing relapse recurrence in recovered, recurrently depressed patients. The website declares the evidence from 2 randomized control clinical trials, notice 2, that's all you need, of MBCT indicates that it reduces rates of relapse by 50% among patients suffering from recurrent depression. The study claims that the treatment results in something called a reduction in risk of 39%, which, by the way, the 39%, which is close to 40% and is therefore almost 50%, which is how they get to the 50% on the website. But a proper look at the figures shows that what the treatment actually achieves is not prevention, but merely a reduction in the likelihood of relapse. And a proper analysis of the figures shows that it is actually 26%, not even 39%. And this too for a very specific population. They tested on people who had been depressed previously and had recovered from it on at least 3 occasions. They had to be people who were not suffering from depression when they received this treatment, and it had to be the case that their depression should not be caused by life circumstances. So even in this highly select population, 7 out of 10 people would not be helped. And in these papers, they make a little mention of the people who had suffered depression on 2 or less previous occasions, and they say in these papers that the treatment was not helpful to them. But if you actually look at the figures, this group actually becomes more ill because of the treatment. So on this basis, I would go further than Ben Goldacre to say that the current situation in psychological science is not just bad science, but corrupt science. Well, it is no coincidence that CBT has come to prosper in the time of neoliberalist austerity. Not only is CBT's understanding of the human condition closely aligned with the ideology of neoliberalist individualism and the managerialist fetish for imaginary measurement, the notion of austerity was integral to CBT's very conception, and it is a part of its DNA. 10 years ago, it was the economic argument contained in Layard and Clark's The Depression Report that convinced the Labour government of the day to pour hundreds of millions into backing this treatment over all others. And it's very instructive to have a look at this report. The report claimed that these are all quotes from the report, 1 in 6 citizens would be diagnosed as having a mental disorder, depression or anxiety, and that evidence-based psychological therapies had been proved to lift half this number out of their suffering. And they also say the most developed of these therapies is cognitive behavioral therapy. The business case was a no-brainer. Someone on incapacity benefit costs us £750 a month in extra benefits and lost access. If the person works just 1 month more as a result of treatment, the treatment pays for itself. We have a solution that can improve the lives of millions of families and cost the taxpayer nothing. Further, the total loss of output due to depression and chronic anxiety is some 12 billion a year. Of this, the cost to the taxpayer is some 7 billion. These billions of pounds lost through inactivity are a huge cost when compared with the 0.6 billion a year which a proper therapy service would cost. Who would not invest 60 pence in order to earn £7? That's a dizzy 1,166% return, a stockbroker's wet dream. Convinced, the Chancellor wrote out the cheque and so activated the time of CBT. The solution is CBT, the problem is mental illness. And austerity measures are merely the means of getting more value for money, of getting cheaper, more efficient treatments for those suffering from mental illness. This is the value-free rhetoric. But of course, austerity plays a significant part in the creation of the so-called mental illness. As austerity bites, businesses close and public services are cut back to the bone and then into the bone itself. More and more people find themselves unemployed. Consequently, they suffer from increasing stress, depression and anxiety. And so they end up costing the exchequer money for treatments, money in benefits. Government ministers appear blind to the fact that it is their austerity agenda itself that has increased the burden on the exchequer. But they are very alert to the promises made by Layard and Clark in the Depression Report that their treatments would get people off benefits and into gainful employment. It was no surprise then to discover that in 2014, senior ministers sought to put in place mandatory CBT in job centres as a condition of receiving benefits. Layard and Clark's CBT thesis is that people are unable to work because they are ill with depression and anxiety, self-esteem, low self-esteem, or some other mental disorder. Treat the illness and they'll get back to work. New diagnostic categories have started to appear in speeches and papers emanating from the Department of Work and Pensions. 2 of them, psychological resistance to work and entrenched worklessness. I'm also reminded of the diagnostic category drapetomania, which is this strange habit or strange tendencies slaves had to try to run away. Anyhow, the Department of Work and Pensions is offering lucrative contracts of providers of treatment for mental illnesses of this kind. This is a quote from one such tender. The Cumbria and Lancashire Job Centre Plus identified a need for provision that uses innovative methods to inspire entrenched worklessness claimants to address the barriers and issues preventing them entering the work arena. The programme will change the hearts and minds of claimants by empowering them to take responsibility for improving their lives. The key objectives of the programme are to challenge claimants' benefit dependency, increase claimants' self-esteem, and inspire claimants to make lifestyle changes. If any of you have such a programme, do it. So this is where the medicalised, individualised accounts of neoliberalism and CBT come together to form a powerful, unholy alliance. The blame for an individual suffering is within the individual. They either suffer from a chemical imbalance or some form of cognitive malfunction or excessive dependency, or they are feckless and work-shy. There is a bespoke, tailor-made treatment for each and all of these. But the pain caused by austerity also blights the lives who are lucky enough to be in employment. Spending cuts, presented as savings, mean that people are being required to work more for longer for less money. A few years ago, the staff of an NHS day hospital had to reapply for their jobs on a lower pay scale. On the staff notice board of this very hospital, afflicted by staff absences which are generated by a mix of extraordinarily high levels of stress caused by the distress of patients, shortage of resources, shabby working conditions, staff shortages, and persecutory managerialism, I saw pinned to the notice board a pamphlet, Happiness at Work. It is produced by an employee assistance program called CIC. Their task is to offer emotional support, counselling and advice to the staff of the institution. In its first paragraph it asks, how do we find happiness at work when we are facing unrealistic deadlines and feel underappreciated? And how do we create happiness at work? In the second paragraph it answers, fortunately, a recent boom in happiness research has prompted scientists and psychologists to ask what happiness is and extrapolate steps to achieve it. Good fortune indeed. Next comes the central dogma in its most succinct form. Happiness is related to our internal well-being rather than external factors. Because our pleasure in external factors, in new things, pall quickly. Being awarded a pay rise can raise happiness levels temporarily, but once we adjust to having more money, the happiness fades. Additional wealth makes little difference to our happiness levels after our basic financial needs have been met and we have comfortable housing, clothing and enough to eat. The advice to the workforce is that happiness is an attitude. We either make ourselves miserable or happy and strong. The choice is yours. It is up to you whether you are happy or not. It has little to do with your material conditions, your boss, your colleagues. Happiness is a state of mind, an attitude. And all tracks on happiness echo Layard and Seligman and the like to make these sorts of banal pronouncements. This is just a paragraph that I don't have time to sort of do a deconstruct of it, but just to read it out. One way to improve happiness at work is to feel in control of your destiny. You don't have to be in control, just to feel in control. When things don't go your way, it's all too easy to blame others. You may think that life would be better if your management were more supportive or your client was less demanding. Having a good moan can feel very satisfying, but it's very unlikely to change the situation. Most people are focused on satisfying their own needs rather than thinking about those of others. In an organisation, the person who cares most about your own development and well-being is you. I want to mention one other thing in terms of psychology, which really deserves much more time, which is to do with the fact that psychological knowledge and insight is openly being put to very questionable ends. For example, psychologists have been implicated in the design of torture regimes in Guantanamo Bay. Psychological insights have been used to manipulate and are being used to manipulate the citizen to buy more and desire more. There are whole psychology departments dedicated to developing addictive apps on smartphones. There's a fantastic article on this in the New York Review of Books just out. And there I find, we are told, that Nir Ayal, a professor of applied psychology at Stanford's Graduate School of Business, has written a book called Hooked: How to Build Habit-Forming Products. Okay, so I come to group analysis finally, in the time of austerity. These are the times in the social context we're living in. Neoliberalism, managerialism, the fetishization of data, psychological insights appropriated by states and academia and used to manipulate and control citizens. What can be the fate of group analysis in this context? But first, what is group analysis? To many, group analysis is simply a form of psychotherapy. The psychotherapy that helps people get better and feel better. But like the other psychodynamic psychotherapies, group analysis is already sidelined and is in danger of being entirely forgotten. What should be done? Well, one strategy would be to follow Peter Fonagy and colleagues and try to legitimate group analysis in the eyes of commissioners by putting it through the required research protocols that are acceptable to the regulatory and academic authorities. And it is very possible to do this, and in many ways I think it is possibly quite easy to do this by following the well-established formulas that have proved to be so successful with CBT, interpersonal therapy and so on. What would this look like? Well, to begin with, the treatment would have to be tested for efficacy for one of the diagnostic categories as found in the DSM. The mode of research would have to be tightly defined. It would include the number and type of patients, the duration and number of sessions, and so on. The illness levels of the patients would be measured through some questionnaire at the start of treatment, at the end, and possibly at various points as you go along. The group analysts would be provided with a toolbox filled with a limited number of specific interventions that they could draw on. There might be directives about which of the tools are to be used in the early, middle and latter parts of the treatment. The scores would be put through statistical analyses and compared to those scores of those who had no treatment. If the clinical significance could be shown to be more than 5%, and by the way, there's a term that's appearing called p-hacking, clinical significance for this entity called p. And it seems that you can always manage the statistical manipulations to get to land on the right side of things. So anyway, if one could do this, then the study would count as a success. If this happened, you would repeat it, and then you would have 2 studies, and then you would be granted a license. Once you've done this, you would repeat the whole procedure for another diagnostic category. So we could do this. But the protocols of psychological science would require that the treatment would have to be manualized. And this is so because the scientific method requires predictability and consistency, not only regarding outcomes, but also methods. Manualization is a way of ensuring that the method remains the same, whoever is implementing it. The manual is a record of what has been seen and shown to work. Therefore, if all future practitioners follow the recipe steps written out in the manual, they will produce similar outcomes of those of the initial trial. Now, many group analysts are of the view that to follow this course would be no bad thing. You have to do whatever it takes to survive. Many think it would be politically astute to follow Fonagy and colleagues in the way that they legitimated and made acceptable a form of therapy they named interpersonal therapy. The virtue of proceeding in this way is that Fonagy has found a way to keep something of the psychoanalytic attitude alive in statutory context by giving it academic respectability. However, the cost has been that whatever it is that we may call the psychoanalytic attitude has been reduced into lists of skills and competencies that the analyst is required to learn and operationalize. Perhaps that is a cost we should be willing to pay. But to my mind, if we did this for group analysis, I think that the end product would not be recognizable as group analysis, particularly because of the prescriptive nature of manuals. In this way, group analysis would be reduced to a mechanistic methodology, a mechanistic rule-following enterprise. This would have its advantages, of course. For one thing, training needs would be vastly reduced. Practitioners would no longer need to be trained as psychotherapists, rather they would need to be trained in the use of manuals. But as we know, group analysis is not a homogeneity. and it is not a homogeneity precisely because of its open improvisational nature. In our community, there is not even a consensus as to what group analysis is, nor is there any agreement as to the paradigm that group analysis fits into. Notice, in the descriptions of the research methods, I found myself using the term treatment. If group analysis is a treatment, then it sits within the medical paradigm. And the way it is often talked about, it is also placed in the scientific paradigm. Whether you agree with this or not, the structures of our training and professional institutions, such as the IGA and its affiliates, indicate that the official line is that group analysis is a science and it is a medical treatment. Why else would our institutions have scientific committees that organize scientific meetings? Well, scientific treatment is a way of fixing something that is broken or not working. Much like one might fix a car, it's value-free. Science is a study of causes. This is why CBT is so insistent that it should simply focus on the cause of how difficulty is being maintained, and why it thinks that the reasons why people have become depressed is of little relevance to the treatment. Whereas I think, and possibly you think, that real psychotherapy is not about cause but meaning and reasons. And meaning and reasons are not graspable by the methods of positivist science, at least not without the distortion that reductionism will require. I personally am not in favour of going down the positivist scientific research route for many reasons, the prime one being that I think the current research culture is corrupt. It is not only bad science, it is corrupt science. To join would not only be to collude with corrupt practices, but also to legitimate and reinforce those practices as well as their findings. But even if one were to subscribe to the fixing treatment paradigm, there remains the question, what does fixing mean? In the case of cars, it means, say, that it no longer stalls. In the case of physical disease, it means, say, that harmful bacteria are no longer present. In these instances, we could say that fixing means that car and body is brought to a state of functioning that conforms with expected norms. Notice the word conform and norms, which are perfectly appropriate here. But is it conformity that is desired when it comes to states of mind? When the scientific method and medical model are applied to the functioning of human life, there's real danger that the psychotherapy is put in the service of conformity. Most worryingly, the patient not conforming with the expectations of the therapist or decreed norms becomes the grounds and evidence for their illness. My point is this: a psychotherapy or analysis that conceives of itself as a scientific medical treatment will of necessity be an instrument of conformity, because the principles of science require consistency and uniformity in outcomes. But this is clearly the government's agenda behind the intention to put CBT practitioners into job centres. They want to put unemployed people through treatments which fix them so that they can fit back into society. The principle that people should be enabled to have functioning lives is honourable, but the ideology that lies behind it is insidious. Fixing or mending is a process that moves something from a state of broken to working. It is a neutral, context-free, asocial description. A machine either works or it does not. But because humans reside in the relational realm of meaning, there is no objective endpoint called fixed or even healthy that all humans would agree on. This is because notions of reason and meaning are intrinsically ethical. In the human realm, the question is not just one of broken functioning, but also of right, wrong, and good and bad. One might even agree with the happiness banality that one feels good when one does good. Well, more accurately, I should say that one feels good when one does what one thinks to be good. Your good is likely to be different to mine. If that is so, is the purpose of psychotherapy to help people learn to do the good that they think to be good? And what if their good is my bad? This is exactly the sort of questions of complexity that the banalities of the so-called science of happiness cannot begin to fathom nor engage with. Their insights boil down to generalized, decontextualized advice, such as make 3 gestures of goodwill before breakfast and you will feel good for the rest of the day. But group analysis is more than a therapy. The relentlessly rationalist, cognitivist, command and control paradigm that is in the ascendancy has poured scorn onto depth psychology and the insights of psychoanalysis, specifically that of unconscious processes. Unconscious processes are outside conscious experience, yet they inform the rationales we give for our beliefs, thoughts and actions. The cognitivist paradigm avoids depth because therein lies the realm of meaning and reason. But group analysis goes further and deepens the psychoanalytic insight with its conception of the social unconscious, and in so doing it develops a metapsychology that is at odds with the individualistic conceptions of almost all other schools of psychotherapy, be they cognitivist, psychoanalytic or humanistic. The conception and role granted to the social is a powerful constitutive one. The social is a politicized space generated by the power relational field. It is part and parcel of the structuring and development of the psyches of individuals from before the first moments of their existence. This immediately makes group analysis something much more than a mode of therapy. Group analysis is also potentially a critical social and political theory, and a viewpoint from which one can critique and question the established world order, psychological as well as political. In many ways, perhaps most ways, the ethos of group analysis is the opposite of the philosophical, psychological and pseudoscientific norms that prevail in today's climate. To my mind, the psychotherapeutic process in the radical version of group analysis is a political process. It is also an ethical process. When we add ethics into this mix, then psychotherapy is also philosophy. Politics at its best is practical ethics. Politics is the struggle to create a good and just world. Ethics, my sense of right and wrong, is integral to this struggle, as it is to my identity, to my sense of self, to my psychology. A group analytic psychotherapy of this kind will not produce obedient, compliant subjects, but unruly, subversive ones that will question and challenge authority. This kind of therapy will not fit into and comply with the requirements of the ordered world of the bureaucrat, and nor should it. Group analysis is subversive, and subvert should. Potentially, group analysis is unruly and disruptive, and that is its virtue. It is a virtue that we should do our utmost to hold on to. To end, I find myself reaching for the same quote from Raymond Gaita that I've used before, because it captures so eloquently what I want to say. We should cease to look for reductive positivist justification, while at the same time refusing to concede that this is intellectual dereliction. Thank you.